Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in less than 6 hours, a G20 nation suspended its constitution, deployed special forces to seal its parliament, and watched its currency collapse to multi year lows? What if I told you this wasn't some distant dictatorship, but the world's 10th largest economy, home to Samsung and Hyundai, a so called model democracy that Western nations hold up as the crown jewel of Asia? On December 3rd, 2024, it took exactly 24 minutes for South Korea to dissolve into military rule. 24 minutes. That's less time than it takes to watch a sitcom. And in those 24 minutes, every assumption you hold about the safety of your assets, the permanence of your rights, and the stability of democratic institutions evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch. But here's what should terrify you even more than the martial law itself. Within hours of the currency crash, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, along with the Bank of Korea, issued a statement pledging unlimited liquidity to stabilize markets. Unlimited liquidity. Let that phrase sink in for a moment. It's the same desperate language used during the 2008 global financial crisis. It's the same phrase uttered before every hyperinflationary event in modern history. It's the government's way of saying, we're about to print money with reckless abandon, and we're praying you don't notice until it's too late. This isn't just an Asian political crisis, friends. This is a liquidity warning, a flashing red signal that the entire architecture of modern finance rests on a foundation far more fragile than you've been led to believe. Because if it can happen in Seoul, the tech capital of Asia, a nation that's supposed to represent everything the West aspires to achieve in the East, then it can happen in Paris, in London, in New York. The democracy premium you think protects your portfolio is a myth, an illusion that can be revoked with a single televised address. We are witnessing a mathematical endgame, friends, a structural fault line that runs beneath every major economy, waiting for the right pressure point to snap. And South Korea just showed us exactly where that fault line leads. Let me give you a number that should create what I call cognitive overwhelm. During the panic, Bitcoin on the South Korean exchange Upbit crashed by nearly 30% in minutes, dropping to approximately 71 million won. This was while global Bitcoin prices held relatively steady. Do you understand what that means? The fastest horse in the barn, the most liquid digital asset in existence, tried to flee through the exit door and got trampled in the stampede. There was a massive negative Kimchi Premium, a complete inversion of the normal market dynamics. Korean traders weren't buying at a premium anymore. They were selling at a discount, desperately trying to convert their crypto into anything that might escape the country before capital controls slammed shut. This is not a story about North Korea. This is not a story about political theater or democratic backsliding. This is a story about what happens when the sovereign itself becomes the risk, when the very government that's supposed to protect your property rights becomes the entity most likely to confiscate them. Now, to understand why this matters to you, sitting wherever you are right now, we need to go back to the genesis of this system, because what happened on December 3rd wasn't some random coup. It was the ghost of history returning to collect a debt that South Korea thought it had paid off decades ago. May 17th, 1980, the coup of Chun Do-hwan. This was the last time martial law was effectively declared in South Korea, leading to the Gwangju uprising and decades of military dictatorship that followed. The bodies in the streets, the tanks rolling through civilian neighborhoods, the systematic erasure of dissent. That period is seared into the Korean national consciousness like a brand. It's taught in schools as the Dark Age, the authoritarian nightmare that modern South Korea supposedly escaped. But here's what they don't teach in those textbooks, friends. The authoritarian instinct never died. It just went dormant, waiting in the constitutional code like a virus in remission, ready to activate the moment the host body weakened. Article 77 of the South Korean Constitution, that's the legal mechanism that was used, the executive override, the presidential power to suspend civil liberties in times of emergency. And the beautiful, terrifying thing about Article 77 is that the president gets to define what constitutes an emergency. Think of it this way: you believe your property rights are written in stone, carved into the bedrock of constitutional law. In reality, they're written on paper, and the president holds the lighter. For 6 hours on December 3rd, that paper was burning. The entrance to the National Assembly was sealed by police buses, special forces helicopters circled overhead. Soldiers in full combat gear took positions at the doors of democracy's temple. And during those 6 hours, if you tried to move capital, if you tried to access your funds, if you tried to exercise the rights you thought were inalienable, you were frozen. The system didn't break. The system was used to dismantle itself. Now, the official narrative, the story the government wanted you to believe, was that this was about North Korean communists, domestic threats, the tired old playbook of external enemies justifying internal crackdowns. But let me tell you what this was really about, friends. This was about a liquidity crisis and a domestic political deadlock that had paralyzed the government for months. President Yoon Suk-yeol was facing a hostile National Assembly that had blocked his budget, rejected his appointments, and essentially neutered his ability to govern. He wasn't declaring martial law to protect the nation from invasion. He was declaring it to force through a legislative agenda using the threat of military force. This is what I call the sovereign rug pull. The moment when you realize that the rule of law isn't a principle, it's a luxury. And when political survival is threatened, that luxury gets discarded faster than yesterday's newspaper. Which leads us to the system's most crucial secret, something we need to explore with surgical precision. Because what happened in those 6 hours wasn't just a political crisis. It was a stress test of the entire financial scaffolding that holds modern economies together. And friends, that scaffolding just revealed a crack wide enough to drive a freight train through. December 3rd, 2024, 10:23 p.m. Korea Standard Time. President Yoon appears on national television, his face grave, his tone apocalyptic. He declares emergency martial law, invoking threats from anti-state forces and North Korean sympathizers. Within minutes, not hours, minutes, the machinery of state power lurches into motion. Police buses form barricades at the National Assembly. Military helicopters thunder overhead. The internet hums with confusion and panic. And in the global financial markets, which never sleep, the algorithmic traders and currency desks see the headlines flash across their screens. The Korean won implodes. The currency collapses to a 2-year low of 1,444 won per US dollar in offshore trading. Not gradually, friends, instantly. This is the danger zone, the numerical threshold that currency traders know signals systemic breakage. When a major currency crosses certain technical levels, it triggers automatic selling programs, margin calls, and what's called contagion risk. One domino tips, and suddenly the entire chain is falling. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. In the way that watching a building implode in slow motion is fascinating. The won wasn't the only thing that collapsed. Look at what happened to the so-called safe haven assets, the digital fortress that's supposed to be immune to government interference. Bitcoin, the permissionless money, the asset that doesn't care about borders or parliaments or presidential decrees, crashed 30% on Korean exchanges while trading normally everywhere else in the world. Think about what that means. This wasn't a global Bitcoin crash. This was a localized panic so severe that it created a parallel reality in Korean markets. The Kimchi Premium, which typically sees Bitcoin trading at a premium in South Korea due to high local demand, didn't just disappear, it inverted, it went negative. Korean traders were dumping Bitcoin at massive discounts, selling at prices significantly below global rates. Why? Because they understood something that the rest of the world was about to learn. When the sovereign turns hostile, when the government declares emergency powers, the next move is always capital controls. You lock the exits before you rob the building. And in that moment of clarity, every Korean crypto holder with half a brain was trying to convert their digital assets into anything that might escape before the trap snapped shut. This is your canary in the coal mine, friends, not the political drama, not the television images of soldiers and helicopters. The real warning signal was the market behavior, the fastest, most liquid assets trying desperately to flee and finding the door already closing. Now let's talk about the foreign money, because this is where the contagion spreads beyond Korea's borders. Foreign investors, the international capital that props up Korean stocks and bonds, saw those headlines and did what foreign capital always does when sovereign risk materializes. They ran for the exits. In the immediate aftermath, foreign investors net sold 320 billion won, approximately $241 million in Korean shares. That might not sound like a massive number, but understand what it represents. It represents the Korea discount widening, that permanent risk premium that says, we know your economy is strong, we know your companies are profitable, but we also know your government can suspend the Constitution in 24 minutes, so we want a discount for that risk. This is the forensic evidence I'm talking about, friends, the specific tangible proof that the rot is real. Let's look at what happened to Korea's digital banking infrastructure, because this is where theory meets reality in the most brutal way possible. Toss Bank and Kakao Bank, two of South Korea's largest digital financial institutions, had to suspend foreign currency exchange services due to what they politely called volatility. Volatility. That's the corporate euphemism for a run on the bank. When customers are trying to exchange won for dollars or yen or anything that might hold value outside Korean jurisdiction, and you can't fulfill those requests because you don't have the liquidity or because you've been instructed by regulators to slow the bleeding, you call it a temporary suspension due to market volatility. But we know what it really is, don't we? It's capital flight. It's the realization, spreading through the population like a virus, that the money in your account might not actually be yours if the government decides otherwise. And once that realization takes hold, once the psychological barrier breaks, it's almost impossible to rebuild trust. The Financial Services Commission, Korea's market regulator, understood this. They immediately prepared a 10 trillion won stabilization fund. 10 trillion won to buy stocks, to prop up the market, to create the illusion of stability. And here's your signal, friends. When the government has to buy the stock market, when the supposed free market requires government intervention to prevent collapse, that's not a market anymore. That's a Potemkin village, a facade being held up by increasingly desperate monetary printing. The liquidity injection, the Band-Aid slapped over an arterial wound, because here's what that 10 trillion won represents. It's not real capital. It's not savings that Korean citizens accumulated through productive work. It's printed money, digital entries in a ledger, the monetary equivalent of writing yourself a check and pretending it's income. And this connects directly to that phrase we discussed at the beginning, unlimited liquidity, the Ministry of Economy and Finance pledging to provide whatever it takes to stabilize markets. What they're really saying is, we will debase our currency, we will print as much as necessary, we will sacrifice the long-term purchasing power of everyone in existence to prevent the immediate collapse of asset prices. This is the playbook, friends. This is what every government does when the edifice starts to crumble. They don't fix the foundation, they just print more money and hope the illusion holds long enough for them to get out. Now, you might be thinking, but the martial law was lifted. The National Assembly voted 190 to 0 to revoke it. The crisis ended. Democracy prevailed. The soldiers went back to their barracks. The helicopters flew away. Everything returned to normal. And on the surface, that appears to be true. The constitutional process worked. The safety switch functioned. The checks and balances held. But let me ask you something, friends. If someone breaks into your house, waves a gun around for 6 hours, and then leaves without taking anything, do you feel safe? Do you trust that they won't come back? Or do you start looking for a new house? The trust is gone. The social contract, that invisible agreement that says the government will respect your rights and protect your property, was revealed to be conditional, revocable, subject to change based on political convenience. And once you see that, once you understand that your assets only exist because the government allows them to exist, you start making different calculations about where to store your wealth. The foreign capital knows this. That $241 million that fled Korean stocks in the immediate aftermath, that's not coming back. And it's going to be joined by billions more as international investors reprice Korean assets for sovereign risk. The Korea discount, which was already significant due to concerns about North Korea and corporate governance, just widened by several percentage points permanently. But here's what keeps me up at night, friends. Here's the part that should terrify every person watching this, regardless of where you live. South Korea isn't some fragile emerging market. It's not Argentina or Turkey or Lebanon, countries with histories of coups and currency crises. It's the world's 10th largest economy. It's a member of the G20, the exclusive club of major economies that supposedly sets the rules for global finance. It's an OECD member, a supposed bastion of democratic capitalism and rule of law, and it took 24 minutes to descend into military rule. So let me ask you directly, what makes you think your country is immune? What makes you believe that the constitutional protections you rely on are any more permanent than South Korea's? Is it because you live in America with its long tradition of peaceful power transfers? Tell that to the citizens who watched January 6th unfold. Is it because you live in Europe, in one of those social democracies that supposedly perfected the balance between freedom and security? Ask the French protesters who faced riot police for years about the permanence of civil liberties. Is it because you live in a country that's never experienced authoritarian rule? Neither had South Korea, not since 1987, not for nearly 40 years of democratic governance. The liquidity tide is going out, friends, and we're about to find out who's swimming naked. Because here's what the South Korean crisis revealed, what it exposed with brutal clarity. The entire global financial system operates on the assumption that governments will act rationally, that property rights are sacred, that the rule of law is inviolable. But those aren't laws of physics. They're not mathematical constants. They're social agreements. And social agreements can be revoked with a single executive order, a single declaration of emergency, a single televised address at 10:23 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Every stock you own exists because the government enforces property rights. Every bond you hold is valuable because the government promises to uphold contract law. Every bank deposit you have is accessible because the government maintains the payment infrastructure. Take away that governmental guarantee, suspend those rights for even 6 hours, and the entire scaffolding reveals itself to be far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. This is what I call the no escape encirclement, friends. Let's walk through your options systematically, because I want you to understand how thoroughly the trap has been set. You think about stocks. The Korean stock market, the KOSPI, would have crashed if not for that 10 trillion won stabilization fund. But even with government buying, even with that massive intervention, foreign investors are fleeing because they understand that the returns they might make don't compensate for the risk that the government might suspend trading, might impose capital controls, might decide that foreign ownership of strategic assets is suddenly a national security threat. You think about bonds. Korean government bonds, supposedly safe haven assets, saw their yield spike as investors demanded higher compensation for holding government debt. Because if the president can suspend the Constitution, what's to stop the government from suspending debt payments, from restructuring obligations, from engaging in what they'll politely call a selective default, but what is really just theft with bureaucratic language? You think about cash. The won collapsed to 2-year lows, and the government response was to promise unlimited liquidity. That's code for inflation, friends. That's the government telling you that they're going to print enough currency to make your savings worth less with every passing month. The money illusion at work. You'll have the same number of won in your account, but they'll buy fewer groceries, pay for less gasoline, cover a smaller fraction of your rent. And you think about crypto, that supposed escape hatch, that permissionless alternative to the traditional system. But remember what happened on Upbit, Korea's largest cryptocurrency exchange. A 30% flash crash, suspended withdrawals, frozen accounts. Because when the government declares an emergency, when sovereign risk materializes, the centralized exchanges become just another choke point, just another institution that can be pressured, regulated, or shut down entirely. This is the encirclement, friends. Every traditional avenue of wealth preservation requires the government's blessing to function. And we just watched a government revoke that blessing in real time. So, where does that leave us? What are we actually facing here? Because this isn't just about South Korea anymore. This is about a convergence of forces that are hitting simultaneously, creating what I call a trifecta of systemic failure. Force number one, political instability. President Yoon Suk Yeol is now a lame duck facing potential impeachment and possibly arrest. His own party has turned against him. The opposition smells blood in the water. There's a power vacuum at the center of the 10th largest economy in the world, and power vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled with either chaos or authoritarianism, and sometimes both. This political paralysis means no coherent economic policy, no ability to respond to external shocks, no credible commitment to reforms. It's a government in name only, going through the motions while the ship drifts toward the rocks. Force number two, currency debasement. That unlimited liquidity pledge isn't a safety measure, friends. It's a suicide pact. The Bank of Korea and the Ministry of Finance have essentially announced that they will print whatever amount of currency is necessary to prevent asset price collapse. They will monetize government debt. They will buy corporate bonds. They will inject liquidity into banks. And every single one of those won they create dilutes the value of every one already in existence. This is the invisible tax, the silent theft that happens through inflation rather than confiscation. You don't wake up to find your bank account emptied. You wake up to find that your bank account buys 20% less than it did a year ago, then 30% less, then 50% less. The number stays the same, but the purchasing power evaporates like water on hot asphalt. And force number three, export collapse. South Korea's economy is built on exports. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK Hynix, these corporate giants that dominate global markets in semiconductors, automobiles, and consumer electronics. They're called the chaebols, the family-controlled conglomerates that are essentially too big to fail. But here's the problem. Their largest export market is China, and China's economy is slowing. The property sector is in crisis. Consumer spending is declining. Industrial demand is weakening, so the chaebols are already facing a demand shock from their biggest customer. Now add a political crisis at home, a currency collapse that makes planning impossible, and sovereign risk that makes foreign partners nervous about long-term contracts. These companies cannot afford a political catastrophe on top of an economic one, but that's exactly what they're getting. Three forces, three structural pressures hitting simultaneously: political chaos, monetary debasement, and economic contraction. That's not a recession, friends. That's a sovereign crisis. That's the kind of convergence that leads to currency collapse, capital flight, and the wholesale restructuring of an economy. And here's what you need to understand: this isn't unique to South Korea. This is the condition of every major economy right now. The political systems are fragile. The currencies are being debased. The real economies are weakening beneath a facade of asset price inflation. South Korea just gave us a preview of what happens when the facade cracks. Now, I want to talk about something that's even more dangerous than the economic and political forces we've discussed. I want to talk about your mind, because the greatest threat you face isn't external. It's the voice inside your head telling you that everything will be fine, that this is just another news cycle, that the adults in charge will fix things before they get too bad. This is what psychologists call normalcy bias. It's the hardwired tendency of human beings to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday, that the patterns which have held your entire life will continue indefinitely, that the rules which governed the past will govern the future. It's a survival mechanism that works beautifully in stable environments, but it becomes a death sentence in unstable ones. Let me give you an example. In the 6 hours that martial law was active in South Korea, how many average citizens actually moved their money? How many called their banks, liquidated positions, bought gold, or transferred funds offshore? A tiny fraction, because normalcy bias told them this is temporary, this will blow over, the system has survived worse, there's no need to panic. And on December 3rd, they were right. The martial law was lifted. The system held. But here's the thing about normalcy bias: it's right until it's catastrophically wrong. It works perfectly every time except the last time, and you don't get a warning about which time is the last time. The citizens of South Korea who didn't move their money during those 6 hours got lucky. The constitutional process worked. The National Assembly voted to revoke martial law. The president backed down. But luck isn't a strategy, friends. And the next time this happens, whether it's in Seoul or Paris or New York, you might not be so lucky. This connects to another psychological trap called the money illusion. You look at your brokerage statement and see that your portfolio is worth $1 million and you feel wealthy. You feel secure. You believe you've achieved financial independence. But that $1 million exists as digital entries in a database, entries that can be frozen, confiscated, or devalued by government decree. You're not actually wealthy, you're just holding claims on wealth, IOUs, issued by institutions that exist because the government allows them to exist. The money illusion says, I have $1 million, therefore I'm a millionaire. The reality says, you have a claim on $1 million that's only valuable if the government enforces property rights, if the banks remain solvent, if the currency maintains purchasing power, and if the political system remains stable. Remove any one of those conditions and your $1 million is just a number on a screen. This is what happened to South Korean citizens during those 6 hours. They went to bed believing their won deposits were money. They woke up to discover those deposits were hostages. The number didn't change, but the nature of what that number represented changed completely. So let me ask you the question that should be echoing in your mind right now. What do you actually own? Do you own assets or do you own claims on assets? Because there's a difference, friends. a profound difference that becomes crystal clear the moment the system comes under stress. You think you own stocks, but you don't own the companies. You own shares, which are legal claims on company profits, claims that only have value if courts enforce property rights and if markets remain open for trading. If the government suspends trading, if they impose capital controls, if they decide that foreign ownership of strategic sectors is suddenly prohibited, your shares become worthless paper or worthless digital entries, which is even worse because at least paper can be burned for warmth. You think you own bonds. But bonds are just IOUs from governments or corporations. They're promises to pay, nothing more. And promises can be broken, restructured, or inflated away. Ask the bondholders in Argentina, in Greece, in Lebanon, how much their government bonds were worth when the sovereign decided it couldn't or wouldn't pay. You think you own real estate, and real estate is better than financial assets because it's tangible, it's real. But here's the problem. Real estate requires a functioning legal system to maintain property rights. It requires courts, title registries, and police to enforce your ownership. If the government decides your property is needed for national security, for public use, for emergency housing, they can take it. They'll call it eminent domain or compulsory acquisition, and they might even promise to compensate you. But the compensation will be paid in the debased currency we've been discussing, and it will be worth a fraction of what your property was actually worth. So what's the alternative? What do you actually own when the system reveals itself to be conditional, when property rights become suggestions rather than guarantees? This is the binary choice, friends. This is the fork in the road where you have to decide what kind of assets you want to hold. Assets that require permission to own, or assets that exist regardless of what any government says or does. Gold, silver, physical precious metals that have been money for 5,000 years, long before the Bank of Korea existed, long before the Federal Reserve was created, long before central banks discovered they could print currency at will. Gold doesn't care if Parliament is sealed by helicopters. It doesn't care if the president declares martial law. It doesn't require a functioning court system or a stable government or an operational banking sector. It just is. It's elemental. It's real. And here's what I mean by real. When you hold a gold coin in your hand, you're not holding a claim on gold. You're not holding a promise that someone will give you gold later. You're holding the actual asset. No counterparty risk. No government guarantee needed. No trust required in any institution whatsoever. This is what I mean when I say we're witnessing the transition from illusion to reality, from paper wealth to hard assets. The South Korean crisis was a stress test, and paper wealth failed spectacularly. The one collapsed. Stocks required government intervention. Bonds spiked in yield. Bank deposits were frozen. Even cryptocurrency, which is supposed to be the digital alternative to government money, crashed 30% on centralized exchanges. But gold did what it always does in moments of crisis. It held its value. Not in one terms, obviously, because the one was collapsing, but in real terms, in purchasing power terms, gold maintained its function as a store of value. An ounce of gold in Seoul bought the same amount of rice, of fuel, of basic necessities on December 4th as it did on December 2nd. The number of one needed to buy that ounce changed dramatically, but the actual value didn't. This is stepping out of the line of fire, friends. This is understanding that when the shooting starts, you don't want to be standing where the bullets are flying. And right now, the bullets are flying at anything that requires government permission to exist, anything that's denominated in currencies being debased, anything that depends on the illusion of stability. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking about Bitcoin, about cryptocurrency as the alternative. And let me be very clear about this. I'm not anti-crypto. I understand the appeal of permissionless money, of assets that can be moved across borders without government approval. But the South Korean crisis taught us a critical lesson about the difference between theory and practice. In theory, Bitcoin is censorship resistant, permissionless, impossible for governments to control. In practice, if you hold your Bitcoin on a centralized exchange like Upbit, you're right back where you started. Your crypto can be frozen, your withdrawals can be suspended, your account can be locked by government order or exchange policy. The 30% flash crash on Korean exchanges while global prices held steady proves this point brutally. The Bitcoin held on Upbit wasn't really permissionless. It was just another database entry subject to the same controls as your bank account. Self-custody is different. If you hold your Bitcoin in a wallet where you control the private keys, where no exchange or institution can access your funds, then yes, you have something that approximates the permissionless ideal. But how many people actually do that? How many crypto holders understand the technical requirements, the security practices, the operational complexity of true self-custody? A small minority. For everyone else, for the vast majority of people who hold crypto on exchanges for convenience, cryptocurrency becomes just another asset that fails during the stress test, just another claim that proves worthless when you need it most. Gold doesn't have that problem. Physical gold in your possession is automatically self-custody. There's no technical complexity, no private keys to lose, no wallet software to secure. You just hold it, and it works. This isn't investment advice, friends. I'm not telling you what to buy or sell. I'm telling you to think very carefully about the nature of what you own, about the assumptions built into your wealth, about the conditions that need to remain true for your assets to maintain value, because those conditions are looking increasingly fragile. South Korea showed us that a G20 democracy can suspend civil liberties in 24 minutes. It showed us that unlimited liquidity means currency debasement. It showed us that when sovereign risk materializes, every permission-based asset becomes a trap. And most importantly, it showed us that normalcy bias will keep you frozen in place until it's too late to act. The window for preparation is closing, friends. Not because I say so, but because the mathematical realities we've discussed are playing out in real time. The political systems are fragmenting. The currencies are being debased. The real economies are weakening. And the gap between asset prices and underlying reality is wider than it's ever been. History favors the prepared. And preparation means understanding the difference between illusion and reality, between claims and assets, between permission-based wealth and permissionless value. It means looking at what happened in Seoul and recognizing it not as an isolated incident, but as a preview, a warning shot, a glimpse of what's coming to a theater near you. The question isn't whether this will happen in other countries. The question is when, and whether you'll still be holding paper when it does. Thank you for being here today, friends. Stay vigilant, stay prepared, and most importantly, stay grounded in reality rather than illusion.